problem with a lot of science is that it's explained to us on the grand scale of ecosystems, climate, entire environments and habitats, like oceans and forests. That can mean that it's hard to understand how all of that relates back to the world you see around you. So this time, we're starting where we stand. The ground beneath your feet is teeming with life. Soil and earth is an entire universe that can't be seen with the naked eye. And it's the diversity of this world that's teaching us more and more about the way our world and its systems work. A teaspoon full of soil contains more living organisms than there are people on the planet. From microbes to bacteria, archaea and fungi, we're beginning to understand how what we put into this mysterious world is as important as what we take out.
We need to value a gram of soil more than a gram of gold. Soil organic carbon can be stored for thousands of years.
Soils are alive, and life depends on them. The impact of letting them degrade or become polluted is catastrophic. Here's Q's Gary Egan.
Enzymes are key to mineralise organic matter that goes into the soil to keep the carbon and nutrient cycle going. Often we plant monocultures year after year, and those monocultures might not feed the relevant microorganisms in the soil, and as a consequence, functional groups that have key processes and key enzymes to keep carbon and nutrient being mineralised or being slowly degraded, it may prevent that. There could be a real detrimental climate effect as a consequence of applying pesticides because it damages how the soil functions.
If our soils are unable to support plant life, they'll not yield the food our world needs. If they're polluted, so will be the systems with which they interact, including water. Our economies will suffer, our earth will erode, and life will struggle. But instead, research into soils is pioneering new avenues of learning. Forget the idea of soil as sterile substrates. They feed our world, and our relationship with them is innately connected to global issues such as climate change, food scarcity, and biodiversity loss. So let's uncover some of the soil secrets offering solutions to some of our biggest problems. I'm Dr. Maya Rose Craig, and this is Unearthed, Nature Needs Us, from the Royal Botanic Gardens Kew. If we want to understand how to manage or utilise natural habitats with biodiversity in mind, it's important to look at how systems within them function and interact. Soil plays a crucial role in carbon storage, nutrient cycling, and hydrology. But how did we exhaust this asset?
My name is Ian Wilkinson. I'm co-founder and director here at FarmEd. Soil health is the reason I get up in the morning. I've been working in agriculture for 40 years, and I'm really concerned that our soils have been degrading so slowly, almost imperceptibly, since the last, 70 or 80 years, through the Green Revolution, where we've been producing so much more food, which on the one hand has been astonishing. We've been degrading the soil in the process of doing that, and particularly with our monocultures. So the big question is, how do we farm to produce enough food without wrecking the planet? Almost without exception, all the farmers I've ever known and worked with want to build soil quality so they leave it in better condition for the next generation than they found it. And I think nowadays, particularly, people are so aware with the science and the data that we have about the loss of quality of our soils that there is an even more urgent need to rebuild. And we are definitely extracting a lot, particularly from our annual agricultural crops. There are thousands of farmers, I would estimate somewhere between 10 and 15% of farmers who would call themselves regenerative. And whilst that's a loose term, people are definitely using it to think about a very different future for farming. They're visioning a farming where soil quality is being rebuilt, where the natural world is working alongside farmland, reducing our synthetic inputs and reducing our emissions into the atmosphere.
We'll hear more from Ian and his farm later in the episode. Over to the wet woodland at Wakehurst now, Kew's wild botanic garden, Dr. Gary Egan is a researcher into this invaluable ecosystem resource.
Soils store a lot of carbon. I do get annoyed when people call soil dirt because it implies it has no value, and soil is immeasurably valuable. Soil organic carbon can be stored for thousands of years, or it can be lost almost immediately, especially if you plough soils or you disturb soils. And so we need to understand how to manage habitats, both natural habitats and also agricultural soils as well, to make sure carbon stays where it belongs, locked up in long-term stable pools in soils. Chemical protection is one factor which governs how long carbon can stay in soils, and we need to understand how habitats and management treatments affect the fate of resources going into the soils. Another major thing that protects carbon in the soils is physical protection. When you plough soils, you break down these aggregate structures. The plants, they fix carbon through a process known as photosynthesis. That's how plants grow. And a lot of that energy you see above ground is biomass, but the majority of it, I think something like 80% of that energy goes into the soil and feeds this soil food web. But also, they feed mycorrhizal fungi. Mycorrhizal fungi are an organism that forms a symbiosis with host plants, and they do this because they get the photosynthate, the carbon sugars that they want. And in return, the mycorrhizal fungi increases the root mass, the root area of the host plant, and can take nutrients out of the soil and resources from the soil that the plant roots wouldn't be able to reach by themselves.
Creating value for soils and changing our practices presents us with an opportunity to tackle some of the problems human activity has created. And when it comes to food production, it's an urgent matter.
Now we've got roughly 7.9 billion of us, and of course we've got a real crisis of biodiversity. We've got climate change. There's all sorts of universities researching how we can manage soils in terms of agricultural land. So we do need to make changes in the way we manage landscapes. So have no-till systems, no ploughing or reduced tillage, have cover crops, things like that, to try and reduce the amount of time that there's bare soil, and maybe even choose not to do any tillage at all when you're on certain slopes, and maybe grow trees in those places to avoid the soil loss, because we need soil. Without it we can't grow any food, no life can continue on the earth. One of the key problems with agriculture is the application of fertilisers, ammonium nitrate and phosphorus principally among them. Phosphorus is less mobile, but ammonium nitrate causes real problems. So when you apply it too much, it runs off into rivers and streams and into the sea, and it causes what's known as eutrophication. And because it's got a lot of nutrients, you get algal blooms, and these algal blooms, they shade lower plants, and then these water bodies get low in oxygen and you end up with fish kills. I mean, organisations like the Environment Agency set nitrate vulnerable zones to try and resolve these issues, and farmers are required to apply their ammonium nitrate fertiliser at times where it's going to be taken up by the plant or in lower concentrations. But ammonium nitrate also causes a problem because it goes through a process known as nitrification and then denitrification by soil microbes, and it issues into the atmosphere as nitrous oxide, and nitrous oxide is a potent greenhouse gas.
Now, with DNA analysis, we're able to understand more about how the diverse life within soil underpins how our world was colonised by plants, and how it continues to function and evolve. And there's one kingdom of life that has always had an enormous part to play. Other than bacteria, fungi are the most diverse group of organisms on the planet, and they present a new frontier of discovery. Irina Druzhininya is a senior research leader at Kew. She invited us to explore Kew's Fungarium, a collection that started when a pioneering Victorian mycologist donated his collection to Kew for research. Today, the Fungarium is home to collections from both the UK and overseas.
We believe that there are 1,300,000 individual specimens of fungi and fungi-like organisms in the Fungarium. UK can be considered as one of the birthplaces of modern fungal science, that is mycology. Fungi are the unique organisms that share their common ancestor with animals. And probably something like 1 billion years ago, there was an organism that then gave rise to two lineages. And fungi, therefore, are more related to us than to plants. They penetrate the environment and they are frequently out of sight. We have to estimate their diversity. But what is absolutely amazing, these invisible microorganisms can be amazingly huge. There is a textbook example of the span of one fungal colony that colonized the entire forest in Oregon. So that was confirmed by molecular data that it was one organism growing through the entire forest, and that has several tons in this biomass, and that was estimated that it was several thousand years old.
Thanks to DNA analysis of soil samples, plant materials and sediments, scientists have been able to get an idea of the diversity of fungi. Kew's State of the World's Plants and Fungi Report 2023 estimates there are between 2 and 3 million species of fungi in existence.
From this number, we now know a little bit more than 155,000 of species. The rest, we know that it exists, and we can now approach it by digital techniques. So this diversity of fungi, we call it as the fungal dark matter, dark fungal diversity. So there are many terms describing this inability to get them in culture, to assess their morphology, physiology. But it's not because we are ignorant and we neglect this diversity, but because these fungi, they need their substrate. And at this moment, we still cannot imitate the conditions in laboratory that can be suitable for them. For example, the huge group of fungi that live inside the digestive tract of ruminant animals. And they are crucially important for the digestion of cellulose, but these fungi, they definitely live without oxygen and a high acidity. With molecular techniques, we can estimate their diversity. We know that life on Earth depends on plants and bacteria that produce organic matter and also oxygen as the side product of photosynthesis. But we should understand that life of plants depends on fungi, so that fungi are fundamental and a very, very great scale. So they are ecosystem-forming organisms together with plants. And that it's very hard to imagine that plants could colonize land without the help of fungi. So we now have fossilized and other proofs of the very tight interactions between plants and fungi already in the Devonian period, like 400 million years ago or more, when the first plants started to establish on the land. Fungi, they are also very efficient decomposers, so that they decompose organic matter, and importantly, they are also able to decompose plant biomass. By doing this, fungi, of course, return quite a big amount of carbon back to the biosphere environment, and that is a very essential role.
It's the nature of fungi to penetrate our environments, which is why understanding and protecting them and these interactions is fundamental to both preserving the health and biodiversity of whole systems.
Probably the greatest diversity of fungi can be found in soil, and soil is a very complex and very heterogeneous medium that we are trying to understand. Soil is fully penetrated by fungi, and these are fungi that probably form mutualistic interactions with plants, these mycorrhizal fungi, and many fungi can also grow under organic matter in soil and occasionally form interactions with plants. So these fungi can grow under dead organic matter, and the decomposers, we call them saprotrophs. They are also abundantly present in soil.
Our soils are particularly abundant in a division of fungus you might recognise, club fungi, or Basidiomycetes. That's agarics, puffballs, stinkhorns, chanterelles, smuts and bunts, to name a few. Some club fungi produce an external fruiting body, such as a mushroom, which is visible to the human eye. But there's so much more to the life cycle of this organism and its interactions in nature than we can see. So looking after its environment is crucial.
It's really difficult to protect an individual fungus. We need to protect ecosystems. So that the protection and conservation of fungal diversity requires the conservation of the entire habitat, and the way how we can do this influences how diverse and how stable the habitat will remain.
Shall we go for a walk around?
Phil Wilkes is the research leader on Kew's Nature Unlocked programme.
Nature Unlocked is Kew's UK-focused conservation research programme based here at Wakehurst. The programme has been going since 2021, and the objective is to value and quantify and then communicate the value of UK nature to not only policymakers and government, but also to the general public. So Wakehurst is being used as a living laboratory. We're actively researching the landscape, so we're installing instruments into different habitats across Wakehurst to measure all sorts of things. So we're looking at below ground carbon and mycology. We're looking at above ground carbon and habitat structure using terrestrial LiDAR. We're trying to couple this with airborne LiDAR and satellite remote sensing. So we're sort of looking at the whole suite of across the scales. We're also coupling this with pollinator research. So we have volunteers out, and we have a citizen science program at the moment called Trees for Bees, so people can go out and record bees in the landscape. And we're trying to bring all this information together to tell a sort of complete story about the co-benefits of nature.
Using remote sensing technology like ground lasers allows research to build detailed pictures of complex landscapes in 3D and predict things like tree volume, which in turn helps understand how much carbon might be stored above ground. We'll hear more about the pollinator and wellbeing projects from Nature Unlocked in a later episode, but Phil showed us around one of the areas where the team are studying carbon today.
We are in Pearstons Wood, which is a coppice woodland. It's actively managed, so it's got an understory of hazel and an overstory of oak trees. On a 7-year rotation, the hazel is cut down to the ground and used for construction or for fencing posts and things like that, and then it's allowed to grow again for another 7 years, so it's sort of an actively managed woodland. This area of Kew Wakehurst is open to the public. It's not that often visited by people, which I think makes it quite special. There's a number of paths running through it, and there's lots of things to sort of discover in this part of Wakehurst. There's lots of art and installations, but there's also science equipment out in the landscape. We're here on a coldish morning at the end of March, and it's very wet. But yeah, the forest is sort of just coming into life. You can see catkins on the hazel, and there's lots of birds singing, as you can probably hear. So we're just walking past some of our instruments in the landscape, and these are automated instruments that measure the CO2 efflux, so the amount of carbon dioxide that's coming out of the soil. And this is really important to understand how these different habitats are functioning. This is one of the largest networks of these types of sensors in the UK, so we've got them here in our coppice woodland. We also have them in our wet woodland, conifer plantation, and in an ancient meadow system. So we're sort of collating all this data, and with this dense time series of data, we can sort of compare the function of these different habitats.
So why is it important to revisit some past agricultural and land management practices, such as coppicing, to find out if they might be useful today, in a different era, with different needs?
Coppicing used to be a really common way of managing the landscape, and used to be a really big employer. But now that sort of industry has lapsed, and particularly in the south of the UK, there are vast areas of overstood coppice. One of the things that we're looking at here is, can these areas be brought back into production, and what are the co-benefits to doing so? There's industry, which is fantastic, but you're also drawing carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, storing it in the wood. Is that a viable nature-based solution? But there's also other benefits to biodiversity. So you're modifying the landscape, understory flora can come back up, then the hazel trees grow again, and this encourages other aspects of biodiversity. It also could be beneficial to hydrology. Hydrology is important because it's how water flows through our landscapes and where it goes. So if you can slow water down, sort of flowing into our rivers, then this is, great for flood prevention. But also, it's great for stopping sediment running off into rivers. It has many benefits, and trying to grasp where this water is going is really key. Particularly somewhere like Wakehurst, which sits above Ardingly Reservoir. So Wakehurst forms quite a large part of that catchment. So how does the way that we manage Wakehurst impact that water supply? It's really important questions like that we're trying to get to the bottom of.
As Phil explained, ecosystems provide a complex array of services to nature, from water flow to carbon storage. And exploring the science of these interactions can help inform how we might manage the forests and landscapes of the future.
I think there's been a tendency to manage landscapes for one particular aspect. So at the moment, there's a lot of focus on managing landscapes to store carbon. So a really good way of storing carbon is to plant lots of conifer trees. Our recent redwoods paper that we've recently published shows that these trees draw a lot of carbon down from the atmosphere and store it in the wood, and they can be stored there for a very long time. But that's only one aspect, that's only one ecosystem service that forest is delivering. And I think we need to move away from this sort of one aspect rule and look at ecosystem function as a whole, and what are the benefits of having an ecosystem that delivers many things. So it may not be the best for carbon, but it's great for biodiversity. It's great for nature connectedness. Trying to balance these different aspects is really important.
Madagascar is home to around 26 million people and 14,000 species of vascular plants. That's plants with tissues for carrying water and minerals around and conducting photosynthesis, by the way. Poverty is driving people in Madagascar to cut down forests and grasslands in order to survive, which in turn creates a threat to biodiversity and a high risk of extinction for many species. More than 93% of its 3,118 tree species exist only on this island, and 2/3 are threatened with extinction. Its grassland habitats are also at risk. Kew's Madagascar Conservation Centre has been protecting the unique flora and fauna on the island since 1986, and today it has over 60 colleagues working on different projects. Livasoa Randriamanalina is a project manager for KMCC and has been working with farmers in the Ankafobi Special Reserve.
Here we are working with farmers to improve livestock production while supporting biodiversity. The wonderful fingerpod grassland and pastures that we can use them to feed zebu, which in turn feeds people better by providing milk and meat, also supporting grassland biodiversity and preventing fires from damaging forests. We're working with farmers to improve grazing methods, which means more meat and milk for community.
Zebu are domestic cattle, but they also play an important role in Malagasy cultural events, such as weddings and Independence Day celebrations. Providing support for local populations is fundamental in protecting biodiversity, not just here in Madagascar, but around the world. Connecting cultural values with exploited habitats can change our relationship with conservation and motivate those who are most closely connected with them. But it's not just endangered habitats where this is the case. Later in the episode, we'll be visiting a UK farm to hear from farmers embracing soil sciences in the way they work. But first, let's hear how another British habitat is teaching us about the interactions between our soils, plants, fungi, and those greenhouse gases in our air. Imagine skylarks singing, coconutty fragrance, yellow gorse in full bloom, and heather, and a strong wind. And you'll find Elena Arrigoni.
I am Elena Arrigoni, and I'm a postdoctoral research associate in the mycorrhizal ecology research group at Kew Gardens. We are currently standing on one of the highest viewpoints at Thursley National Nature Reserve, and from here we have a really clear view of the beautiful surroundings. It's 325 hectares nestled in Surrey. We have woodlands, we have bogs and patches of dry heathlands. It's actually one of the last and largest remaining heathlands in South England and in Surrey. Heathlands used to be much more common in the UK, but unfortunately since the 1800s we've lost about 80% of heathland habitats. It's home to quite specialised biodiversity. We can find species, plants and animals and fungi which are specialised to the heathland habitat, such as sand lizards and other reptiles. We find around 20 species of dragonflies. We find rare plants such as the marsh club moss, and we also find pyrophilous fungi which emerge after wildfires sweep the heathland. Thursley Common has been an open-air laboratory for the last 30 years at least. At Thursley we're working on a project supported by the government through the Joint Nature Conservation Committee, the JNCC, where we look at how habitats, and in particular heathlands, recover after air pollution has declined. Air pollution acts as a fertilizer and changes the biodiversity of the heathlands and the ecosystem composition of heathlands. Heathland soils are nutrient poor, and this is why they rely on mycorrhizal associations to unlock these nutrients and absorb them. We measure nitrogen in the air by placing little cartridges that contain a filter that absorb ammonia, and we collect them once a month, and we can measure how much ammonia has been deposited on the environment over a time span of a month. We use a mix of chemical analysis. We literally look at roots of heathers and rhizoids of liverworts, and we look for specialized structures that mycorrhizal fungi form in the roots and in the rhizoids of these plants. We also use DNA-based techniques that allow us to identify the fungi that associate with the plants. We are in the early stages of the experiment, and we are very excited to what comes next, because we are hoping to find measurable indicators of habitat recovery, focusing in particular on the below ground, and we hope that the below ground environment, soil and mycorrhizal associations will be included in environmental policy by the British government.
Governments look to science to inform the decisions that are made in how we manage land, fund its management and support nature, both nationally and internationally. There's been quite a bit of research into the above-ground activities of heathland, but exploring the mycorrhizal world is the next pioneering piece of the puzzle. Different landscapes are all unique in the life and biochemical processes that underpin them, and it's the microorganisms that we don't see that play a vital role in helping keep them stable to support life and ecosystem services. The dual threat of climate change and unsustainable human activity mean that coastal salt marshes are under pressure. The flood protection they provide, as well as the species, commercial and recreational activities they support, are impacted.
We are losing them in quite certain speed. I think the main threatening factor is the human use, that human try to mine this ecosystem and try to use it for agriculture and also for industrial purposes. And because of this, the plants just ruined and many animals will lose their habitats. My name is Fen Cai. I'm now an associate professor currently employed by the Sun Yat-sen University located in Shenzhen, China.
We heard from Marina Druzhina earlier in the episode. Her colleague, Feng Shai, found his interest in fungi burgeoning when he turned his attention to the coastal salt marshes in Jiangsu, China. The high level of plastic pollution here caused him to think a little more about how the biochemical processes of fungi here might help us solve other problems.
We think that fungi probably can also do something else, like the first pioneers to eat plastics. This is one reason I work with fungi, because they are powerful. Fungi actually is the simplest eukaryotic cell on this planet, and we work with it, then we get to know more about ourselves. The salt marsh that I worked with now and in the past is actually located in one of the largest tiny flat that located in the east part of China. And one ecological function of this salt marsh is that it protects the shores from the waves. They provide very important habitats that some special animals like birds, like deer, and also fungi as well. They can have this special niche to colonize and to make life there. I went to the salt marsh area and found, the plastic pollution shocked me at that moment. If there are something happening, the microorganisms, they are evolving, then this could be one of the first places that microorganisms learn to how to degrade plastics. So we just try and go there, sampled, and luckily found some positive strands. I think it's not that rare that some of the fungi or bacteria can eat the plastic because they secrete quite different enzymes to eat the substrate around them. Plastic actually is made by carbons, so this material can also provide carbon sources for microorganisms like fungi. We think that with the technologies that we use in hands like protein engineering and also the directional evolution theory, then we can speed up the evolution of the enzymes to make them more efficient in degrading plastics. And with this, we are actually quite hopeful to have something really useful in the industry that can help people or help this planet to clean up this plastic pollution.
This fungi learning is now powering cutting-edge research through strains that can be used to develop substance-degrading polymers like polyurethane and PET. And this isn't an isolated example. Given how little of the fungal world we are yet to identify and understand, what ingenious and elegant solutions might these organisms yet be able to offer humans, if we can research and protect them in their natural environments?
Many fungi live in a biodiversity hotspot like rainforest, but the rainforests are under threat and we are losing them. So many of fungi, they just get extinct before they can be found by us. The fungi that live in the rainforest, they are quite capable in degrading plastics based on our preliminary results.
Across this episode, we've explored the vital role of soil in ecosystems. But how does farming with soil health in mind also present opportunities to improve economies, industries, and public health? You met Ian Wilkinson earlier in this episode. Rooted author and farmer Sarah Langford joined him at his farm in the Cotswolds, along with Andy Cato, founder of Wild Farmed.
We're sitting in West Oxfordshire, in the Evenlode Valley at FarmEd with Ian Wilkinson and Andy Cato. I think I met both of you because of writing Rooted and researching it and realising that you were both part of this regenerative revolution that at that point was incredibly niche and now is sort of turned into government policy. But Ian, will you tell us a bit about FarmEd, where we are now in this bucolic setting, looking over cow pasture and sheds and your next door neighbours?
Well, I've had the pleasure of living here for 40 years, actually, bizarrely. About 10 years ago, we thought, well, this would be great if we could sort of show to people that are unaware these amazing things that thousands of farmers across the land either do or will be doing in the future. We're showing the difference between a modern system on this farm versus something else, and something else actually happens to be, in this particular case, ancient grains. We're using an amazing resource from the past. So we're looking back through history, just trying to select things that may well be suitable for our modern problems. And we're trying to understand how we apply that on the farm. So what we don't want to do is to sort of turn the tap off of yield and good economics in a way and suddenly end up with a disaster where suddenly everything fails. So we have a transition to go through. We're trying to learn quickly as we can from ancient past with modern science and the tech where it can be used.
Well, quite. Andy, your farm is about half an hour away from here, but you've not lived there for 40 years.
No, I started, I was a musician for most of my life. Life took a very abrupt turn when I picked up an article about the environmental consequences of today's food system. I took this sort of mad decision to sell my publishing rights and finance the purchase of a farm and try and do it at scale. And we had this local field to plate community buying bread and flour from the farm shop. And then today I'm back over here as a National Trust tenant and co-founder of Wild Farmed, and our mission is how can we bring these field to plate communities, this agency of consumers to use their food choices to do good things, to the high street rather than just to local communities. A couple of weeks ago it was our own Wild Farm branded loaves debuted in Waitrose.
Some of the techniques that regenerative farmers that I've seen and know use, like composting, green manures, bringing sheep back onto cereal crops and so on, those are old techniques that would have been really familiar, especially around here actually, we're in wool country. But this time round, the regenerative kind of revolution feels like it's got a lot more available to it. It's got both tech and science. I think it's important at this point to talk about what regenerative farming means.
In the widest sense, you could say any way of growing food which makes an ecosystem better next year than it is this year is regenerative. Growing food is always going to involve pushing back against nature, because if we walked away from most fields in Europe, they're going to become forest. The closer it is to what nature would do in that space, the less we've got to push back. So if we're looking in front of us now, all this incredibly verdant, lush growth that's had the same awful weather as all the fields around here, and yet looks absolutely fine, one characteristic of it is plant diversity. There's no monocultures here. And none of the weeds that plague our arable fields with sort of quite medieval names like blackgrass, you won't see any in these diverse swards in front of us. So how can we get a bit closer to that? So a real focus of wild farmed growing is, if we are going to grow wheat, for example, let's not just grow wheat, let's grow it with other plants alongside it. And those other plants could do different things, like in the same way that you might put marigolds next to your tomatoes to protect them against aphids. That might be one thing. Or, like the indigenous peoples of South America did, they put beans alongside their corn to fix nitrogen from the atmosphere to feed the corn. So we can build these plant communities that really sort of bring us a bit closer to natural systems. I mean, that has logistical implications because we've got a food system that's based around monocultures rather than polycultures, but that's all fixable.
You've brought on businesses from people outside it, whether it's your micro-dairy or your agroforestry. You've incorporated that within it as well, which I guess kind of ties up with the same idea that nature is complex rather than complicated. This idea that everything has to work kind of holistically.
Yeah, I really like the idea of having, the manure from the grazing animals building up soils. I like the idea of growing legumes to improve soil fertility, because the air's full of nitrogen, but the plants can't use it. Well, legumes, like the Romans found this out. Peas and beans, like Andy's growing with his wheat. It works. We know it works. Now, it might not be as productive. And let's face some truths here. If we back off a little bit on the synthetic fertilisers that we've been putting on, guess what happens? The yield falls back. But we know that road is unsustainable, and that at some point we have to reverse up a bit. And on that basis, what do we do instead? Well, surely we should be using biological systems, shouldn't we? Because we know they are circular, regenerative. They just work, but they won't give us the excess extraction that we currently do. But they still give us a lot of food. And actually, very healthy food. We might find our nutritional quality of food actually goes up.
Well, I think excess is the important word in there, because it's a useful reminder when everyone talks about yields crashing that we produce enough food to feed 3 billion more people than actually exist, and it's lost or wasted 30 to 40% of it. When we're talking about the relationship between soil health and economic health, one of the most important papers that dealt with that was the Desgupta report, which was commissioned in 2019 by the Treasury rather than by DEFRA, to look at how biodiversity loss, soil loss has a real and tangible economic impact for all of us, in the same way that you may be able to value a pot of honey in pence, but you can't necessarily at the moment value all the work that those pollinators are doing for crops elsewhere. We've basically had a column missing from all our economic modelling, which is nature. How do you see that tying in both with regenerative farming and with improvements in soil health? Do you think that there can be an income stream which will enable farmers to change how they farm to improve both of those?
I think there needs to be an income stream, definitely. And I would have thought that the idea longer term of paying farmers not only to produce food but alongside the natural world is absolutely essential. And I think the Dasgupta report was very clear that over half of the trade that we do, whether you're a corporation or whoever you are in business, is predicated on a healthy natural world.
And I think a really important piece of changing that is joining up consumers and farmers. So in these beautiful veg boxes that are being packed around the corner, people can come here and choose to use their food choices for their health, for their environment, for the way it's grown, all these things. If you go into a supermarket, the high street, where most people are forced to buy their foods, you'd be very lucky to know what continent it was grown on, never mind who grew it, So we have to find a way of getting field-to-plate supply chains that can work on the high street, because then you can choose the farmers that you back. As long as those farmers are being clear what they're doing, then we can build this collaboration for change that expands out the value, how we value things.
I think you're dead right, Andy.
When I guess a chicken is cheaper than a pint and a takeaway coffee is more expensive than a loaf of bread, that tells you what the value system is. The public at large receives a huge amount of benefit from healthy soils, whether that's not having their villages flooded, whether that is clean air, clean water, leisure spaces. So whose job is it to pay for this critical regeneration of soil health?
Well, I'd love to say there's a single answer to that, but I don't think there is. I can't think we can ignore the fact that we've created cheap food, but the cheap food is an illusion. So in the National Food Strategy, the externalised cost, in other words, what's not on the spreadsheet in terms of nature costs, exceeds the value of the total food system in the UK. It's just worth thinking about for a second. So it's not like we can't afford to do what we're talking about doing. It's that we certainly can't afford not to do it.
The thing that we do need to recognise as well is the farmers actually get very little of the money. And
exactly
they represent roughly 0.5% at most of GDP.
As little as 1% of the value of the food they make is what goes into the pot.
It's very, very low amount of money. If we pay the farmers money, however we do that, through the food system, through our taxes, I don't particularly have a strong view on what they should be. But as Andy says, it will be made of many things. But the point is, we don't have to pay them. It isn't a lot of money to do a really good job to restore soils. And I think it's actually very simple. You just have to make that money available and have the policy in place on farms to do it.
Well, at the moment it's costing us the earth, so it's going to be a damn sight cheaper than that.
Well, one of the things, of course, that has changed in policy is the sustainable farming incentive. And as far as I can see, it's pretty much the only government policy in the world that is entirely based around farmers receiving subsidy because of environmental farming, as opposed to a scheme which is just about nature restoration.
So we've moved from production to supporting farmers to deliver environmental good things for the population, which is great. But it's not a lot of money. So yes, there's a shift in policy. It really does set a standard, world standard, because this hasn't happened anywhere else as far as we know, not in the Western world. But I think, again, on the money, you have to be realistic. You need a lot more money to make this happen. I think it's just short of £3 billion for the Sustainable Farming Incentive and the new ELM scheme. We won't get into the acronyms, but that's public money for public good, replacing what we would all know as subsidies for the last 70 years.
Which is going to take place on 70% of our land, because 70% of our land is farmed land.
If there's one thing that we can learn from the last 80 years experiment that sort of went under the name of the Green Revolution, so this very extractive conventional farming system, is that we can only have a resilient and nutritious and sustainable food supply if it works in harmony with nature. And so one of the things that needs a bit of work under these current subsidies is that a lot of the money is directed to non-productive nature, so planting flowers, in a manner of speaking. And if you're actually growing food in a way which is in line with nature, so these polycultures we were talking about before, whatever your choice might be, there's much less money for that than for these non-productive nature areas, and we need to sort that out.
Well, I think that kind of one of the best ways of demonstrating how farming can change soil and its health is to go and dig some up, because here at Farm Ed, Ian, you've kept a field and farmed it conventionally alongside changing your farm practices on the other fields. So you've got a like for like right next door to each other. So should we go and have a look?
Yeah, let's get the spade out. We're actually going to the wheat field here ahead of us, which is a control plot which receives fertilisers, and it does yield an astonishing amount of grain. But let's have a look at the soil and see what it's doing. It's been farmed this way for about 70 years. continual annual crops. No earthworms though.
That's what I'm looking for. We're just shaking the soil off the roots. One of the signs of biology in the soil is that there's this, basically plants are doing a deal with this creatures in the soil, and they've been doing this deal for 500 million years, where they photosynthesize and turn sunshine into sugars, and they send that down to this vast array of creatures, of which we understand about 1% at the minute, who then go and get the nutrients that the plants are asking for in exchange for these sugars. And it's an infinitely complex and rather beautiful system, and one sign that it's working is when these sugars that are being exchanged are very sticky, and so you get soil that sticks to the roots, and they're called rhizosheaths. They look a bit like kind of dreadlocks. To be fair, there are one or two on the upper stages of the roots, but they've got a lot of white bare roots towards the bottom.
The plants are totally dependent on what we're putting on the top though, but they do give us a lot of yield, that's for sure. But it's quite expensive now with fertilisers, and it's a very unpredictable market. Made from oil and gas, of course, nitrogen fertiliser, which means emissions at that stage. Plus, I'm afraid when we put this fertiliser on this crop, we get nitrous oxide emissions. So there's two nasty greenhouse gases coming off it, but we do get a lot of yield. Should we have a look at another crop then?
Yeah, let's do that.
So this is a ley. A ley is also known as grassland, temporary grass, which is growing for 4 years before we plough it up and put in a crop of wheat. And you can see here lots of diversity, lots of different plants. Same soil, you can hear the stones.
So stony. So stony.
Wow. That's a different prospect altogether, isn't it?
Oh, crikey, it's heavy.
Does it smell different? Did you smell the other?
Yeah, I did, and it's just completely different beast altogether. Look.
And this is like chocolate cake. And there's worms, and it's very sweet smelling.
And you know, when things go really dry here, what's important is that this keeps growing, so it remains green. You know, in that hot summer we had 2 years ago, when the temperatures were really horrible, you know, these things were, because they're so deep rooted, just stay green.
If we just talk about rain and the ability to hold on to water, the reason why this is darker and more crumbly and more sweet smelling is because of the carbon that the plants have created from sunshine. So to be able to deal with these extremes of weather, you know, it's extremely important that we build these carbon levels in our soil.
Wasn't there? And there was a report that came out last year that said if we restore 1% of organic matter in half of the world's degraded soils, we would keep our planet within 1.5 degrees of warming, would meet all our Paris greenhouse gas emissions just through soil.
Get this right, everyone's happy.
Ian Wilkinson, Andy Cato, thank you very much.
The biodiversity of our soil is connected innately to every system it supports. The more we learn about this incredible unseen world, the more we can appreciate the services it provides and adapt our practices for the benefit of all. Challenging generations-held beliefs and histories is a vital part of that equation. We need to evolve our values in line with what we know supports economic and public health today. But where there's already stretched livelihoods on the line, it's so important that there is policy and funding to back up this transition. Next time, we move from soil to seed and hear how conservation and research into this field is changing our potential to restore habitats and adapt to our changing climates. We'll follow intrepid researchers into the Arctic and find out how local communities are integral to carrying out research projects and informing scientific knowledge. And we'll discuss how everyone can benefit from conservation research and restoration when done the right way. Join me next time on Unearthed, Nature Needs Us. I'll be back in a fortnight. You can find out more about Kew and support their vital scientific and educational work at kew.org. And don't forget, you can catch up on earlier series of the podcast on this feed too. Please follow and subscribe.